Winter took her husband away. Spring was supposed to take her house. She was left alone with her 2 sons and decided not to wait. When the water receded, it became clear who was wrong. Subscribe and write in the comments where you are watching from. The winter that followed him did not announce itself with drama. It simply stayed. It pressed down on the land with a patience that felt intentional, as if it had decided that this place, this family, would not be released easily. The plains stretched wide and pale beneath a sky that never seemed to lift, the horizon blurred by wind-driven snow that erased distance and direction alike. Trees were rare here, and those that survived grew bent and stubborn, their branches twisted, as though they had learned early that straight lines did not last. Sound traveled far in such openness, yet the world felt muffled all the same, wrapped in cold so complete, it swallowed echoes before they could return. The settlement lay scattered across the frozen ground, a handful of houses set far enough apart that each stood alone in its own struggle. Smoke rose thinly from a few chimneys, not in confident columns, but in hesitant threads that broke apart almost as soon as they reached the air. Roads existed only in memory during winter. Snow covered the ruts and paths until everything became the same endless white, and travelers moved by instinct rather than markers. Help, when it came at all, arrived late. More often, it did not come. It was in this winter that she became a widow. Her husband had not died in a way that would later be told with pride. There were no witnesses to speak of courage, no final words carried back by a companion. He had gone out alone with a borrowed sled and a promise to return before nightfall, intent on trading for flour and salt from a settlement several miles away. The weather had been uncertain that morning, the kind that tempted men into believing they still understood the land. By noon the wind had risen, and by evening the sky had closed entirely. He did not return. They found him 2 days later, when the storm passed enough for searching to begin. He lay less than 5 miles from home, his body half buried in a drift, one hand still curled around the rope of the sled. He had turned back at some point, she was told. He had been close. Close enough that the knowledge of it burned far worse than distance would have. The news reached her quietly. A neighbor came to the door and stood there too long before speaking, his hat in his hands, his eyes unable to meet hers. She listened without interruption, without the sharp intake of breath others expected, and nodded once when he finished. Only after he left did she sit down on the edge of the bed and press her palms against her face, not to cry, but to steady herself. There were children in the house. Crying could wait. The burial took place the next morning. The ground was frozen solid, and the men who came to help worked with slow, careful swings of their tools, stopping often to warm their hands. There was no sermon, no speeches about legacy or honor. The wind would not have allowed it even if someone had tried. They lowered him into the earth, covered him, and stood in silence for a moment that felt both too long and not long enough. Then people drifted away, one by one, returning to their own homes, their own fires, their own worries. On the frontier, grief was respected, but it was not shared for long. Everyone had their own winter to survive. She returned to the house with her sons and closed the door behind them. The sound of it shutting echoed through the small space with a finality that startled her. It was then, in that quiet, that she understood something had shifted beyond repair. She was no longer waiting for him to come back inside, stamping snow from his boots, asking what was left for supper. The waiting itself had ended. The boys were 12, born in the same year, close enough in age to be mistaken for twins by strangers, but different in every way that mattered. The older one, by minutes, had always carried himself as if that small distinction meant something. Since their father's death, that tendency sharpened into something harder. He spoke more loudly, moved with exaggerated purpose, and bristled at correction. He wanted to prove he could fill a space that no longer existed. The younger watched everything in silence. He noticed how boards creaked in the floor, how the fire burned unevenly in the stove, how their mother's shoulders remained tense even when she sat. He asked fewer questions, but his eyes followed her constantly, as though memorizing her movements might make the world more predictable. Their house had never been strong. It was built quickly years earlier, meant as a starting place rather than a permanent one, and it showed. The walls let in drafts no matter how often they were patched. The floor sloped slightly toward the back, a flaw that had been dismissed at the time, but now seemed more pronounced with each passing week. The stove consumed wood at an alarming rate, and despite constant tending, the cold lingered in corners and underfoot. At night, frost formed along the inside of the windows, delicate patterns that melted and refroze with the rhythm of the fire. Food was rationed carefully. Flour, dried beans, and salted meat were measured and remeasured, portions adjusted again and again as she tried to make the numbers work. The boys complained less than she expected, perhaps sensing the fragility of the balance she maintained. Still, she saw the way their eyes lingered on the cupboard, the way the older one lingered near the stove as if warmth itself could be consumed. As the days passed, she noticed things she had not before. The way the door no longer closed, flush against the frame, the faint smell of damp earth that seemed to rise from the floor after particularly cold nights. When she stepped outside, she saw that the ground near the back of the house sat lower than the rest, a subtle depression that caught drifting snow. She remembered spring floods from years past, remembered neighbors scrambling to save what they could as water crept into their homes. Winter, she knew, was not the only season that killed. Spring was worse. It was a thought that returned to her often as the months dragged on. Winter could be endured with preparation and stubbornness, but spring arrived with force and unpredictability. Snowmelt turned the plains into waterlogged fields. Rivers swelled beyond their banks, and the earth itself seemed to lose its solidity. Houses built low and heavy sank or shifted, their foundations undermined by water that showed no respect for walls or ownership. She had seen it happen more than once. People spoke of spring as relief, but here it was a test, one many did not pass unscathed. At night, when the boys slept, she lay awake listening to the wind scrape against the walls. Her grief came in quiet waves, not the dramatic surges she had feared, but a steady ache that settled into her bones. She missed her husband not only as a man, but as a presence, someone who shared the weight of decisions. Now, every choice rested with her, and the consequences would fall not only on her, but on the children who trusted her implicitly, whether they admitted it or not. Memories surfaced unbidden. Stories she had heard as a child from people who had come west earlier. Tales of families who survived not by following tradition, but by breaking it. She remembered one story in particular, of a home built onto a wagon, another tied to a flat-bottomed boat, structures that could move when the land became hostile. At the time, such ideas had sounded like exaggerations, the kind of stories told to make the past seem more dramatic. Now, lying in the dark, she considered them differently. The thought came to her first as a refusal rather than a plan. She would not lose her children to the land. She would not wait for the river to decide whether they were allowed to stay. The idea that followed frightened her, not because it was impossible, but because it made sense. A house that could move, a home that did not surrender itself entirely to the ground beneath it. She turned the idea over in her mind for days, without speaking of it. She imagined the shape of such a structure, the way weight would need to be balanced, how heat might be contained. She imagined the faces of her neighbors if she were to say it aloud, the laughter that would follow. She imagined her son's reactions, the older one's anger, the younger one's quiet consideration. One evening, as the wind howled particularly fiercely, the older boy muttered something about how none of this would have happened if their father were still alive. The words struck her harder than the cold ever could. She did not raise her voice when she answered, but there was steel in it nonetheless. His father was gone. That truth would not change. What could change was what they did next. Later that night, she sat at the rough wooden table with a single candle burning low. The house creaked around her, responding to the cold as it always did. She thought of the spring that would come whether they were ready or not. She thought of the river, swollen and indifferent. She thought of her sons, their futures fragile and entirely dependent on the choices she made now. When she finally spoke the thought aloud, there was no one there to hear it. The words sounded strange in the empty room, unfamiliar, yet solid. The house must move. It was not a wish, not a hope. It was a decision. Outside, the wind continued its endless work across the plains. Inside, something shifted, quietly but irrevocably. The winter still held them in its grip, but beneath the cold and the grief, a new resolve took shape, one that would carry them forward into whatever came next. The decision, once spoken, did not lift the weight from her shoulders. If anything, it settled more firmly there, no longer an abstract fear, but a responsibility with edges and consequences. Winter still ruled the land, but its grip had begun to loosen in subtle ways. The days lengthened by minutes, the sun lingered a fraction longer above the horizon, and the snow, though still deep, no longer felt endless. It was during this uneasy pause between certainty and change that she began to act. She started with what she had. There was an old flat-bottomed boat behind the house, pulled up years ago when the river shifted and left it stranded. Its boards were weathered and warped, the seams dry and cracked, but the frame remained sound. Her husband had once said it could still float if someone cared enough to fix it. At the time, it had been nothing more than a passing remark. Now it became a foundation. She worked in silence at first, rising before the boys and stepping outside into the cold while the world was still gray and hushed. Her hands stiffened quickly, but she forced them to move, prying loose boards, clearing snow, testing weight and balance with careful steps. Each plank she lifted carried a memory. Some had been cut by her husband's hands, others hauled together years ago when hope had been easier to come by. She did not allow herself to linger on those thoughts. Memory, like winter, could paralyze if indulged too long. When the boys discovered what she was doing, their reactions came as she had expected. The older one stared at the boat in disbelief, then laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that carried more fear than humor. He asked what she thought she was doing, demanded to know how a thing like that could ever replace a real house. His voice echoed some of the doubts she had already wrestled with, and hearing them spoken aloud stirred anger she had been holding back. She told him to bring tools instead of questions. If he wanted to argue, he could do it while working. The younger boy said nothing. He knelt beside her and examined the boat with quiet intensity, running his fingers along the seams, tapping wood to judge its strength. When she asked him to fetch nails or rope, he did so without complaint. He did not need convincing. He needed purpose. Word spread quickly through the settlement. It always did. People noticed when a woman worked like a man and when a widow dared to act as though she still had a future. Neighbors stopped by under the pretense of curiosity, leaning against fence posts, offering unsolicited advice that carried the sharp edge of mockery. They told her the idea was foolish, dangerous, a waste of precious time and energy. Some laughed openly. Others shook their heads in pity, convinced grief had unbalanced her mind. The men were the worst of it. They explained how water behaved, how houses were meant to stand still, how boats belonged in rivers, not under roofs. They spoke as though knowledge were the same as certainty, as though the way things had always been done could not fail. She listened without interruption, thanked them for their concern, and continued working once they left. Experience had taught her that most people spoke not to help, but to reassure themselves that they were right. The women avoided her more quietly. Some looked at her with sympathy, others with fear, as if her defiance were contagious. A few whispered that she was asking for disaster, that her children would suffer for her stubbornness. None offered help. On the frontier, solidarity rarely extended beyond shared suffering, and even that had limits. The construction itself was slow and unforgiving. She built directly onto the boat's frame, reinforcing it with salvaged beams from the old house and scraps from the shed. The structure rose unevenly at first, forcing her to dismantle and rebuild sections more than once. Weight distribution became an obsession. She tested every addition, stepping back to study the balance, imagining how water might lift and twist the whole thing if she misjudged even slightly. The stove was the greatest challenge. Heat meant survival, but fire meant risk. She positioned it low, anchoring it as securely as possible, experimenting with venting until the smoke finally drew upward, instead of back into the space. More than once, she had to throw open the door, coughing, eyes streaming, while the boys laughed nervously at the absurdity of it all. Eventually, the smoke thinned, then disappeared altogether, leaving behind warmth that felt like a small victory. Insulation came next. There was not enough proper material to do the job well, so she improvised, packing gaps with cloth, dried grass, and whatever else she could find. It was imperfect, but better than nothing. The interior remained cramped and dim, but it held heat longer with each adjustment. Slowly, the structure began to resemble something more than a desperate experiment. Tension within the family grew alongside the walls. The older boy grew increasingly restless, his frustration spilling over into sharp words and reckless movements. One evening, exhausted and cold, he accused her outright of destroying what little stability they had left. He said his father would never have agreed to this madness. The words struck deep, reopening wounds she had worked hard to keep closed. For a moment, she considered shouting, considered letting her grief rise to meet his anger. Instead, she set down her tools and faced him. She told him plainly that his father was gone, and that pretending otherwise would not bring him back. She told him that survival did not come from nostalgia, but from adaptation. Her voice did not tremble. The finality of her tone silenced him more effectively than any outburst could have. He turned away, ashamed and confused, and returned to work without another word. Gradually, something shifted. The structure stopped wobbling when weight was added. The stove burned steadily. The door fit its frame. These small successes did not erase doubt, but they dulled its edge. The boys began to take pride in specific tasks, arguing less, cooperating more. The younger one suggested reinforcements she had not considered. The older one learned to measure twice before cutting, his movements growing more deliberate. By the time the snow began to soften and sink underfoot, the house stood complete enough to test. It was rough, ungainly, and undeniably strange, but it was solid. She stepped back and studied it in the pale light of late winter, seeing not what others would see, but what it could become. Shelter, movement, choice. The river murmured faintly in the distance, a sound she noticed now with heightened awareness. Spring would come soon. The settlement prepared in the ways it always had, shoring up foundations, stacking sandbags where they could, trusting in familiarity. She prepared differently. On the final evening before the first real thaw, she gathered her sons inside the new structure. The air smelled of wood and smoke, unfamiliar but not unpleasant. She told them what she expected of them when the water came, what to secure, what to abandon if necessary. She did not soften the truth. Fear, she had learned, was best faced directly. Outside, neighbors passed by and shook their heads. Inside, a family stood ready to challenge the season itself. The winter was loosening its hold, and with it came the test of everything she had built, not only with her hands, but with her will. Spring did not arrive the way people spoke of it in gentler places. There were no gradual mornings softened by birdsong, no careful easing of warmth into the soil. It came abruptly, like a decision made elsewhere, without consultation or mercy. One night, the ground still held its shape beneath frozen crust, and by the next afternoon it gave way underfoot, the snow collapsing into dark water that seeped everywhere at once. She felt the change before she saw it. The air shifted, heavier and damp, carrying a smell of wet earth that had been locked away for months. The river's distant murmur grew louder, fuller, as if it were drawing breath. Icicles along the eaves began to drip steadily, their rhythm too fast to ignore. Winter had loosened its grip, but it did not release the land so much as hand it over to something just as dangerous. Around the settlement, people reacted as they always did, with a mixture of urgency and denial. Men hurried to reinforce foundations that had never been meant to withstand water. Women dragged possessions to higher shelves and lofts, choosing what might be saved and what would be sacrificed if the worst came. Animals were moved where they could be, though everyone knew not all would survive. The ground turned to mud so thick it swallowed boots and carts alike, slowing every effort. She watched all of this from the doorway of the house she had built, the structure resting heavy and ready beneath her gaze. The boat beneath the walls creaked softly as it adjusted to the shifting earth, a sound that set her nerves on edge even as it reassured her. She had prepared for this, she reminded herself. Preparation did not mean safety, but it meant choice. The boys felt the tension keenly. The older one hovered near her, restless and alert, his eyes tracking every movement of the water, creeping closer to the low places in the field. He wanted to act, to do something decisive, but there was little left to do now except wait. The younger watched the river, noting how its color changed, how debris began to appear in its flow long before it reached their land. He said little, but when he did, his observations were precise, unsettling in their accuracy. By the second day of thaw, the ground near the old house had become a shallow pool. Boards floated loose, freed from the earth that had once held them fast. Neighbors cursed and shouted as they tried to salvage what they could, their voices carrying across the open space. Some glanced toward her structure, their expressions shifting from ridicule to something closer to disbelief. The house that had drawn laughter now sat waiting, unmoved by the chaos around it. Water reached the base sooner than she had calculated. She felt a flicker of fear at that realization, quickly suppressed. Calculations could be wrong, reactions could not be. She called the boys inside and began securing what could be secured, tying down items she knew would become dangerous if they shifted. She extinguished the stove, knowing fire would be useless once they were afloat. The interior felt smaller with every passing moment, the walls pressing close, as if aware of what was coming. Night fell early, the sky heavy with low clouds that reflected the faint glow of lanterns across the settlement. Rain began then, not a gentle drizzle, but a steady, soaking downpour that accelerated everything at once. The river spilled over its banks without ceremony, claiming fields and fences as if they had never existed. Water flowed toward them in dark sheets, cold and purposeful. She felt the moment the structure lifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a slight easing of pressure beneath her feet. Then came the creak of wood, the sound deeper now, resonant. The boys froze, eyes wide. She told them calmly that this was expected, that the house was doing what it was meant to do. Her voice was steady, though her heart pounded hard enough to make her chest ache. They had not planned for it to happen so quickly. Ropes meant to anchor them longer lay unused, unreachable, now that the water had surged past them. The current caught the structure and tugged insistently, testing its resistance. She made a decision in that instant, choosing motion over resistance. Fighting the water now would only tear them apart. She cut what needed to be cut, freeing them fully. The house lurched, then began to move. Darkness wrapped around them as the settlement fell away behind a curtain of rain. Shouts echoed briefly, then vanished. The only sounds left were the rush of water, the groan of stressed beams, and the sharp intake of breath from the boys as they realized they were truly adrift. Cold seeped in through every crack, sharper now that they were surrounded by water on all sides. The night stretched endlessly. They drifted past fragments of the world they had known. A fence post here, a crate there, the roof of a shed barely visible before it disappeared beneath the surface. The river widened, its current unpredictable, pulling them first one way, then another. She braced herself against the wall, using her body to steady the structure when waves struck it at an angle. Each impact sent a shudder through the frame, a reminder of how thin the margin for error truly was. Fear threatened to take hold then, not as a sudden panic, but as a creeping certainty of how easily everything could still go wrong. She pushed it aside through sheer force of will. The boys watched her constantly, drawing their own strength from her composure. When the older one faltered, slipping on the wet floor, she caught him without hesitation. When the younger's hand shook uncontrollably, she wrapped them in cloth and held them until the trembling eased. Time lost its meaning. There was only water and movement and the unrelenting cold. At some point, exhaustion settled in, heavy and dangerous. She rationed their energy as carefully as she had rationed food in winter, knowing that collapse now would be fatal. She spoke to them softly, reminding them to stay alert, to respond when she asked, to trust the structure they had built together. The house held. It took blows and scraped against unseen obstacles, but it did not break apart. The stove remained anchored, the walls intact. More than once, water sloshed across the floor, numbing their feet, but it drained away again as the balance shifted. Each survival felt temporary, each moment a negotiation with forces far larger than themselves. Somewhere deep into the night, the current began to slow. It was not a dramatic change, just a subtle easing, the frantic pull of the water replaced by a steadier, more deliberate movement. She noticed it first, then pointed it out to the boys, careful not to promise too much. Hope, she knew, could be as dangerous as despair if indulged too soon. They did not sleep. They could not afford to. They waited instead, muscles tense, eyes straining against the darkness. When dawn finally broke, it did so quietly, revealing a world reshaped by water. The river had spread wide across the plains, swallowing boundaries and landmarks alike. In the pale light, the house drifted toward shallower ground, its movement slowing until it came to rest with a final, gentle jolt. Silence followed, profound and almost unreal. The rain had stopped. The wind had eased. The water lay still around them, reflecting the gray sky like a sheet of glass. She stood there for a long moment, unable to move, listening to her own breathing, to the sound of her son's quiet exhalations. They were alive. That knowledge settled over her slowly, bringing with it a weight unlike any she had known before. Relief, exhaustion, and grief tangled together until she could not separate them. She did not celebrate. There would be time enough for that later, if at all. For now, there was only the task of enduring what came next. As the light strengthened, she saw the settlement in the distance, or what remained of it. Houses sat crooked or broken, some reduced to floating debris. The river had taken its share without hesitation. She thought of the faces that had watched her work with disbelief, of the laughter that had followed her efforts. Those sounds felt very far away now. The spring had not asked their permission. It had come, taken what it wanted, and moved on. In its wake, it left them changed, suspended between what they had been and what they would have to become. The house rested quietly, scarred but whole, bearing the marks of the night's trial. Inside it, a woman and her sons waited, knowing that survival wasn't an ending, but the beginning of something harder still. Morning did not arrive with celebration. It crept in cautiously, as if unsure whether it was welcome after the violence of the night. The light spread thin and gray across the waterlogged plains, revealing a landscape that no longer belonged to memory. What had once been fields and paths now lay submerged beneath a dull, reflective surface, broken only by scattered debris and the occasional dark shape of something that had not survived the flood. The house rested at an angle that made her wary at first. She tested her weight carefully, shifting one foot, then the other, listening for any complaint from the structure beneath her. It answered only with a low groan, tired but intact. The boat beneath the walls had done what she had asked of it. It had carried them through the night and brought them here, to a place neither chosen nor familiar, but solid enough to stand. The boys stirred beside her, their faces pale with exhaustion, eyes red and rimmed with the remnants of fear they had held back for hours. The older one was the first to speak, his voice hoarse, asking whether it was over. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she stepped to the door and pushed it open, letting in air that smelled sharply of wet earth and cold water. Only then did she nod. The worst of it had passed. What remained would require patience rather than endurance. They stepped outside together, careful not to slip on the slick surface that now surrounded them. Water lapped gently against the base of the house, far calmer than it had been in the night. The river had spread itself thin, its fury spent, retreating inch by inch back toward a channel that no longer looked the same. In the distance, remnants of the settlement stood exposed, some houses leaning as if exhausted, others reduced to scattered fragments that drifted aimlessly. She took inventory without comment. The stove still stood, blackened but secure. Supplies were fewer than before, some lost to the water, others ruined beyond use. It was a familiar calculation, one she had made many times before under different circumstances. Survival did not end with the flood. It simply changed its shape. The house had come to rest near a rise in the land, shallow enough that the water would continue to withdraw rather than deepen again. She watched the surface closely, noting the slow, steady drop that confirmed her instinct. The decision to let the current carry them instead of fighting it had brought them here. It had been a gamble, but one grounded in understanding rather than hope. They worked without speaking at first, each of them moving as though guided by an unspoken agreement. The boys checked the exterior for damage, their hands tracing cracks and seams, reporting what they found, with a seriousness that marked how much the night had changed them. The younger one pointed out a section where the wood had split slightly, water seeping in when the structure shifted. She marked it in her mind, already planning the repair. Cold settled in again once the movement stopped. The night's exertion had kept it at bay, but now it crept back into their limbs, heavy and insistent. She relit the stove with care, watching the flame catch and spread warmth through the cramped interior. The sound of it, steady and reliable, grounded her more than she expected. Fire, contained and obedient, felt like a victory. As the day wore on, the water receded further, exposing ground that looked stripped and raw. Mud clung to everything, thick and unforgiving. The world seemed quieter now, as though the land itself were recovering from a fever. In that quiet, sounds carried again. She heard voices in the distance, tentative at first, then clearer as people ventured out to assess what remained. Neighbors approached cautiously, their expressions a mixture of shock and something she recognized as reluctant admiration. No one laughed now. No one offered explanations. They looked at the house, at the way it sat where no house should have been able to sit, and then at her. Words hovered, but none were spoken. She did not invite conversation. She had no interest in acknowledgement, only in what came next. She saw the settlement more clearly as the water withdrew. Some families had lost nearly everything. Others stood amid wreckage that could be repaired with time and effort. Loss was uneven, as it always was, and its unfairness lay heavy in the air. She felt no satisfaction in having been spared. Survival was not a comparison. It was a condition. The boys noticed the looks, the way eyes followed them now. The older one straightened under the attention, but there was no triumph in his posture, only a quiet acceptance of what they had been forced to become. The younger stayed close to her, still observant, still cataloging the changes around them with the careful mind that had carried him through the night. When someone finally spoke, it was not to praise but to ask questions. How had it held? Why had it not broken apart? What would she do now? She answered simply, without elaboration. The house had done what it was built to do. Now it would be repaired. Life would continue. Anything beyond that was speculation, and she had learned the cost of relying on it. As the afternoon faded, exhaustion caught up with her in earnest. Her body ached with a deep, pervasive weariness that went beyond muscle and bone. It was the kind of fatigue that followed prolonged vigilance when the mind finally allowed itself to rest. She sat inside the house and let it come, trusting the boys to keep watch. They did so willingly, their movements careful, protective. In the quiet moments, grief resurfaced, softer now, but no less present. She thought of her husband, of how he would have reacted to the sight of this strange, stubborn structure resting where it did. She did not imagine his approval or disapproval. Instead, she acknowledged the simple truth that his absence had forced her hand. The path she had taken wasn't one she would have chosen freely, but it was the one that had kept their children alive. Evening settled in with a pale, fragile light that reflected off lingering pools of water. The air cooled again, carrying the promise of another hard night, though nothing like the last. She prepared for it methodically, securing what needed securing, planning repairs that could wait until morning. The rhythm of work calmed her, restoring a sense of order to a world that had only just stopped moving beneath her feet. Before sleep claimed them, she watched her sons carefully. The older one no longer spoke of what should have been. He spoke of what needed to be done. The younger asked questions about how the house might be strengthened, how they might anchor it more effectively next time. There was no next time she could guarantee, but she answered anyway. Preparation, she knew, was as much about mindset as materials. As darkness fell, she lay awake for a long time, listening, not for the roar of water, but for its absence. The silence felt strange, almost unsettling after the constant noise of the flood. She welcomed it cautiously. Silence could be broken, but for now, it meant rest. In the days that followed, the settlement began to rebuild in the only way it knew how. People salvaged, repaired, argued, and mourned. She participated when needed, offering help without commentary. Her house remained where it had come to rest, a quiet testament to a different way of surviving, though she never framed it that way. She had not sought to prove anything. She had sought to endure. One morning, as the ground finally began to firm beneath her boots, she stood outside and watched the river return to its altered course. It flowed calmly now, as if nothing had happened, as if it had not rewritten lives in a single night. She understood then that survival was not a victory over nature, but an agreement with it. Resistance led to loss. Understanding led to adaptation. She turned back toward the house, toward the boys already at work, and felt a sense of closure she had not expected. Not an ending, but a continuation shaped by experience rather than fear. The water had come. It had taken and spared without reason. What mattered was that they had remained. The house would be repaired. The land would change again. Winter would return, and spring would follow it, as they always did. She did not imagine a future without hardship. She imagined one with preparation. When she stepped inside and closed the door, the sound echoed softly, no longer final, but firm. They had survived, not by strength alone, nor by luck, but by the willingness to abandon what no longer worked and build something new in its place. That knowledge settled into her like warmth, steady and enduring, as the world outside slowly found its balance again. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters and other stories like this. Watch the following videos to continue exploring these worlds and share this story with someone who might appreciate it.